Hello and welcome to this cozy corner of the internet where I drink tea, we talk about things. That's kind of how this works. And it's basically unscripted, unscheduled, organized chaos, which is practically never going to fit the algorithm, but oh well, because it's real. And it's not high dopamine content because we don't need any more of that. Thank you. Anyway, glad you're here. I have my tea. I have completely forgotten to show my tea in the past few videos, but I have it. I usually have it. I don't always show it, but I have my tea. So if you have a cup of tea or something, grab your tea, grab your water, let's hang out. I have a very interesting topic for us to consider today, and that is imperfect circles. And not just the general topic of imperfect circles, but the specific question, what is the world's most imperfect circle? I was thinking about this the other day, and I have thoughts, but not an answer. So I want to share my thoughts with you, and I want to get your thoughts on it. Because this is a very mathematical question. If we come up with an answer, we can prove it. We can write out an entire mathematical proof proving what is the world's most imperfect circle. It's a mathematical question if I ever heard one, and quite a fun one. Maybe also philosophical. We'll see. So, I have some notes in my notebook, and let's talk about it. So, let's think about this question, right? What is the world's most imperfect circle? Well, my first thought is like, would it be something that's not a circle, but we just call it a circle, right? Like a zigzag. And I was like, that would probably be the world's most imperfect circle, but that doesn't make the question a lot of fun if we just allow it to be anything that's not a circle, like clearly not a circle. So I'm going to implement at least one rule, which is where I say that the start and end points of the shape have to be connected, right? After all, that is very much characteristic of a circle, that the start and end points have to be connected. So it's kind of like, okay, then a square, right? Like, okay, so like not a zigzag, right? Something that's not a circle, but we call a circle, a square. And I'm like, okay, a square is an imperfect circle, I think, just blatantly, right? Like a square is an imperfect circle. But then what about a pentagon? Would a pentagon be more or less imperfect of a circle than a square? Square, pentagon. And the way I started thinking about this is, well, maybe it's not more imperfect, the pentagon, because the pentagon has more corners than a square does. But there is more, what? I don't know. It has more corners, right? More angles. And a circle doesn't have any angles. Well, it has arcs. Anyway, a circle doesn't have any angles. So theoretically, a square which has less angles, would be more perfect of a circle than a pentagon. But what if we think about what those angles are, right? Because a circle isn't pointy and a square is more pointy than a pentagon, even though the pentagon has more angles, because the angle measure of a square is like bigger than the angle measure of a pentagon. And then what if we throw in a hexagon? Is a hexagon a more imperfect circle than a pentagon or a square? Let's just compare a square and a hexagon for a second, right? So we know that the square has fewer corners than the hexagon, but the hexagon is also very symmetric, right? So like it's kind of hard with the pentagon because the pentagon isn't symmetric and a circle is symmetric, right? So then maybe both the square and the hexagon would be closer to a circle than a pentagon if we think about it that way, where it's like, oh, well, it's more symmetrical if we think about the symmetrical aspect. Or, you know, there's more angles on a hexagon than on a pentagon, but the angles are more equidistant, which is closer to the idea of a circle. They're more equidistant from the center, right? And then it's like, okay, what's the next thing? Well, realistically, we have to define a circle and imperfect. We have to define those two words because without those definitions, we're not really going to get much further, right? It's like I've been kind of thinking about concepts, but those concepts that I'm thinking about are like, oh, what if I use the number of angles? Or what if I use how equidistant the angles are from the center? Or if they're symmetrical or not, right? Like those are all different properties, but none of those are telling us, oh, I'm choosing this property as the one to base my definition on. So let's see. There is an official definition of the word circle, and there is an official definition of the word imperfect. Probably, right? Right. Imperfect, when we think about it, it's something that can still be considered a circle, right? Like resembles one, or like can still be called a circle, but just isn't perfect, like isn't exactly right. Which on one hand, philosophy here, a bit of a paradox, because what is the actual definition of a circle? Well, it's something like an infinite number of points, like all equidistant from one point, from one center, right? And so no circles we see in real life are actually perfect circles. Technically, anything that's not a perfect circle is no longer even a circle, technically, right? Because if one point is not exactly equidistant from the center, then it's not a circle, technically. So then my whole thought and question kind of falls apart. So yeah, but if we don't go too philosophical that away, then here's just a little, reel it back a little bit. We'll get back to this in a second, but reel it back for a second. First I was thinking like, okay, the most imperfect circle would be a circle with infinite spikes. Because a circle, right, is points equidistant from one point. So the less equidistant the points are, the more imperfect
the circle is. We're still going to call it a circle if it connects together, right? So this was my first drawing right here, just imperfect spikes. And then I was like, okay, I was drawing the spikes, but then I thought that like if I had a whole bunch of spikes and I zoomed out, it would still look like a circle. So then I was like, maybe I need to make the spikes longer, like not just like this, but like this, which is really long. And then when I thought about that, I was like, okay, well, if I keep increasing the number of really long spikes infinitely, then we're getting to a dot technically. And I was like, hey, maybe a dot is the world's most imperfect circle. But then I thought about it some more, and I was like, okay, well, I'm making spikes, but I'm still having a pattern with these spikes. Like I'm keeping them the same length, and the more imperfect a circle, like to get a more imperfect circle, we need less equidistant, right? But also to have not the same equidistance, right? If they're all non-equidistant, but they have the same non-equidistance, this is like velocity and acceleration. Ignore me if that makes no sense. Ignore that part. Ignore that sentence if that makes no sense. So then I was like, okay, well maybe I make some spikes really big and some spikes really small, and that would make an imperfect circle. That would leave something like this, with a really long spike here and really short spikes here. And it's kind of like, okay, but I don't know how to prove that. Like, what would be the most that? Like, what would be the most imperfect of the most, like, the most number of spikes that are the most random of up and down? And that brings up a whole question of like, what is most random, right? The least equidistant, which means it can't follow a pattern in order to be the most imperfect. So then I was thinking like, well, we have another problem with my question, which is that if I'm defining a circle essentially by just having the line be continuous, then I was like, well, can I just have the lines cross over each other? Like, then it would technically still be a circle, and according to my definition of a circle, which is no longer the exact definition of a circle, I was like, well, would just crossing a bunch of lines over each other make the most imperfect circle? And then part of the idea is like, well, if all the lines cross over in a circular fashion, we're back to that idea of the most imperfect circle being a dot, which no, because I can make the lines cross over more weirdly and not make it into a dot. And then I was thinking, is a circle, like infinite points is what makes up a line, right? Which is also like a circle is made out of line, not out of, but if it's made out of points, right? And what if it's not made out of infinite points? What if it's made out of a finite number of points? Then there's like space in between those points. So then actually it's not continuous and touching. So then it's like, well, then what if the world's most imperfect circle just has those dots with random spaces in between them? That's kind of this, but that didn't get very far. So the reality is that a perfect circle only exists as a concept in our mind anyway. So back to that whole philosophy thing, that any of the circles that we draw, whether it's with a compass, whether it's with a computer, whether it's a circle that's somewhere around us like a plate or a cup, none of them are perfect. None of them are actually 2D either. That only exists in our mind. So someone can draw a circle, like intend to draw a circle, and it can look like not a circle. These are all circles. And so then I just kind of got lost. I was like, okay, it's easier to think about imperfect circles in general than to think about what is the most imperfect circle. Like, I've gone through some of my ideas about it, and I'm like, I don't know, because anything that's not a perfect circle is no longer a circle, actually. Right? But we still call lots of things circles, even though none of them are the mathematical definition of a circle. So maybe the conclusion is either I can't use the mathematical definition of a circle, or there's really no point in asking the question. But if I can't use the mathematical definition of a circle, then I can't write a mathematical proof, right? Anything that is less than imperfect of a circle is no longer a circle. Isn't it so interesting how we have these words that we talk about every single day, and like it doesn't even like we allow all approximate definitions. We can all agree that this is like a circle, or like, not we can all agree. There's so many people that would fight me on this, maybe. But most of the time, we walk around and we would say this is a circle. And life just, that makes it interesting, and language interesting, and communication interesting, and how we agree on approximations. What does that mean? What does that mean for this question? What is the most imperfect circle? Is it a bad question? Maybe. It didn't seem like it at first. Maybe it's not a bad question. Maybe it's just a question that leads to a philosophical answer and train of thought than it does to a mathematical proof. Some questions are like that. So like, what would be like, what is the most imperfect square? Maybe it's just the problem with the word imperfect, because the word imperfect means that we are trying to keep, we are trying to still allow the shape to be called by its name without it being the actual shape. Yeah, so that kind of forfeits the mathematical definition of the shape. This question kind of contradicts itself, even though that it doesn't directly seem to do so. Anyway, that's my random wanderings through pseudo-mathematical, it's not pseudo, like it's actually a mathematical question that we thought through and realized, well, hey, maybe it doesn't work. Okay, that's fine. They don't always work. But sometimes they're fun to think about, and sometimes that's just the conclusion. So hope you had fun, at least. And if you have a thought, or maybe you know what the world's most imperfect circle would be, let me know. Maybe we have to think in other geometry. Like maybe we don't think in just regular 2D geometry. Maybe we think in spherical geometry or taxi cab geometry. Those questions become more fun. Like, what is a circle in spherical geometry? How do we define it there? Or how do we define a circle in taxicab geometry? Those are questions that we can really answer mathematically and that we can think about and we can like prove like, oh, this can exist here or it can't exist here, or what does it look like in this geometrical space? So that's a much better question. And I had a whole lot of fun actually in geometry in university when we thought about these questions. So, yeah. Anyway, thanks for hanging out with me on my random who knows what's it's. And hope you have a great day and see you maybe another time. Bye.